This is the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, on a cold winter's day, as the snowflakes were falling softly and swiftly, a queen sat sewing by her window. As she looked out, the snow scene was framed like a picture by the black ebony of the window frame. As she sewed, the queen pricked her finger and 3 drops of blood fell upon her sewing. The red of the blood against the white of the snow, framed by the black wood of the window frame, looked so beautiful that she thought, "Oh, how I wish I could have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." Now it happened that some time afterwards the queen did have a baby daughter whose skin was as white as snow, whose cheeks were bright red, and whose hair was as black as ebony. The queen called her little girl Snow White. Unfortunately, soon after her child was born, the queen died. A year later, the king married again. The new queen was very beautiful, but she was much too proud of her own beauty. She couldn't bear to think that anyone else might be more beautiful. The queen had a magic looking glass which hung on the wall. Often she stood in front of it and, gazing at her own reflection, asked this question: "Mirror, mirror on the wall, amongst the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror always replied, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." The queen was always content when she heard this reply, for she knew that the magic mirror could speak nothing but truth. Meanwhile, Snow White was growing from a baby into a lovely girl. By the time she was 7, with her rosy cheeks and dark, dark hair against her snow-white skin, she was even more beautiful than the queen. Thus it happened that one day, when the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, amongst the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" it replied, "Amongst the grown-up ladies tall, thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all. Yet the truth I must speak, and so I do vow, that the child Snow White is more lovely than thou." When the queen heard these words, she was both shocked and angry. She looked more closely at Snow White and couldn't fail to see her growing beauty. Each day, as she watched the girl, the queen's anger and jealousy increased. At length the time came when the queen's envy of Snow White's beauty gave her no peace by day or by night. Hatred for the girl filled her heart. Then the queen called for one of her huntsmen and commanded him, "Take this child away, deep into the forest, and kill her. I can no longer bear the sight of her." The huntsman had no choice but to obey. Taking Snow White by the hand, he led her far into the forest, where he stopped and drew out his knife to kill her. The poor child wept and begged him to spare her life. "Please do not kill me," she pleaded. "If you will spare me, I shall go further into the forest, and I promise never to return home again." When the huntsman saw the tears on such a young and beautiful face, he took pity on her. "Run away then, my poor child," he said, as he put away his knife. "The wild beast will soon devour the poor child," he thought to himself. When Snow White ran off into the great forest by herself, she was terrified. She didn't know which way to go, nor yet what would happen to her. She feared she would meet wild beasts which would attack her. She ran on and on, over sharp stones and round prickly bushes with long thorns. She heard the roars of wild beasts, but although some passed by her as she ran, none tried to harm her. By evening, her feet were sore, her clothes were torn, and her arms and legs were scratched by thorns. Just as Snow White was ready to fall down with weariness, she came to a little cottage by the side of a mountain. She knocked on the door, but there was no reply. She tried the door and it opened, so she went inside to rest. Everything inside the cottage was small and neat and clean. A white cloth was spread on the table. The table was laid with 7 little plates, 7 little knives, forks and spoons, and 7 little glasses, all set out in the proper order. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, each neatly made up and covered with a white bedspread. Snow White was both hungry and thirsty, but she didn't want to take anyone's supper. So she ate a little of the food from each plate and drank a mouthful of wine from each glass. Then Snow White was so tired that she longed to sleep. She lay down on the first little bed, but somehow she couldn't make herself comfortable. She tried the other little beds, but each one seemed too long or too short, too hard or too soft. None suited her until she came to the last one, which felt just right. Soon she was fast asleep. Now, the cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who, when it became dark, returned home. They'd spent all day in the mountains digging for gold. As they entered the cottage, each one lit a candle. By the light of the 7 candles, they could see that someone had been there since they left that morning. The first dwarf cried, "Who's been sitting on my chair?" The second one asked, "Who's been eating from my plate?" The third one asked, "Who's been eating my bread?" The fourth one asked, "Who's been eating my vegetables?" The fifth one asked, "Who's been using my knife?" The sixth one asked, "Who's been using my fork?" The seventh one asked, "Who's been drinking out of my glass?" Next, the dwarfs noticed that their beds were not as neat as when they had left them. The first dwarf looked at his bed and cried, "Who's been lying in my bed?" Then each of the other dwarfs in turn looked at his own bed and cried, "Who's been lying in my bed?" But when the 7th little dwarf reached his bed, he found Snow White there, fast asleep. "Look, who's in my bed?" he called to the others, and they all came running to see. They lifted their candlesticks high as they stood around the bed, gazing at Snow White. "What a beautiful girl!" they exclaimed. As the dwarfs were anxious not to waken the lovely child who slept so soundly, they tiptoed away and ate their suppers very quietly. Then, when bedtime came, the 7th little dwarf sent an hour in the bed of each of the other dwarfs in turn, and so the night passed. In the morning, when Snow White first awoke and saw the 7 little dwarfs, she was rather frightened. The dwarfs, however, spoke kindly to her and asked her her name. "My name is Snow White," she replied. "But how did you find our cottage?" they asked. Snow White told them about her stepmother, who had sent a huntsman with her into the forest to kill her, and how the huntsman had agreed to spare her life. "Then I ran and ran all day through the forest," she continued, "until I came upon this little cottage." When the dwarfs heard this sad tale, they were full of pity for the little girl. The eldest one told her, "If you will look after us, keep our house clean and tidy, cook and wash and mend for us, you can live here with us, and we'll take good care of you." "Oh, you are so kind," replied Snow White. "I should be glad to do that." However, before they left the house, the dwarfs gave Snow White a warning. "We are out all day working," they said, "and you will be alone in the house. If your stepmother learns that you are here, she may come and try and do you harm. So be sure, let no one into the house while we're away." Snow White promised to heed their warning. She was very happy living with the dwarfs. Every morning they went off to the mountains to dig for gold. Every evening when they returned home, she had supper ready for them and the house was neat and clean. Although Snow White was alone all day, she didn't feel lonely, for she had so many things to do. Meanwhile, the Queen, believing Snow White to be dead, was quite happy in the thought that she herself was the most beautiful lady in the land. It was some time before she bothered to ask the magic mirror the usual question. When she did stand before the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, among the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" she couldn't believe her ears when she heard this reply. "Thou, O Queen, art exceedingly fair, but the truth I must speak, and this I do swear. Snow White is not dead, but living still, in a little house far over the hill. And thou, O Queen, art certainly fair. This child's great beauty doth make her more fair." The anger was great of the Queen. She knew that the mirror never lied, that her huntsman must have deceived her. The Queen's jealousy would not let her rest as long as she knew that anyone was more beautiful than she was. She determined to find Snow White and kill her herself. But how could she do this? She knew that she must not let Snow White recognise her. Finally, she decided to disguise herself as an old peddler woman who called at people's houses selling things from her basket. She dressed herself in old clothes and painted her face. No one could possibly have recognised the beautiful Queen. Then she travelled through the forest until she came to the dwarf's cottage by the mountain. She knocked at the door and shouted, "Laces and ribbons for sale! Pretty laces and ribbons!" Snow White looked out of the window and thought to herself, "What harm can this poor old woman do to me?" Snow White opened the door, and the woman brought her basket into the cottage. Snow White chose some pretty pink laces for her stays. The old woman offered to lace Snow White's corset properly with the new laces. Snow White, suspecting nothing, agreed. Then the Queen laced her so tightly that the child could not breathe, and she fell on the floor as if she was dead. In the evening, when the dwarf returned home, they were shocked to find their beloved Snow White lying on the floor as if she was dead. They lifted her up tenderly, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the new laces. Soon she began to breathe again, and gradually the colour returned to her cheeks. When the dwarfs heard about the peddler woman, they were convinced that she must have been Snow White's wicked stepmother. The dwarfs warned Snow White again, "Take great care and be sure not to let anyone enter the house." The Queen hurried back through the forest. She was filled with joy because, believing Snow White to be dead, she herself must now be the fairest of all. As soon as she reached home, she removed her disguise and stood before her mirror, asking, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, among the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" You can imagine the rage into which she flew when the mirror replied, "Thou, O Queen, art exceedingly fair, but the truth I must speak, and this I do swear. Snow White is not dead, but living still, in a little house far over the hill. And thou, O Queen, art certainly fair. This child's great beauty doth make her more fair." So, once more the Queen began to plan how she might kill Snow White. First, she prepared a comb which was poisoned. Next, she disguised herself as a quite different peddler woman and filled her basket with new things to sell. Again, she travelled through the forest until she came to the dwarf's cottage by the side of the mountain. She knocked on the door and shouted, "Cheap wares to sell, pretty things to sell." Snow White put her head out of the window. "I dare not let you come in," she said. "I've promised the dwarfs to open the door to no one." "Never mind, you can look, can't you?" replied the Queen, holding up the dainty comb. It was so pretty that Snow White couldn't resist it, and she opened the door to the peddler woman. The old woman said, "You must let me comb your hair properly for you." Snow White agreed and seated herself on a stool. The Queen then stuck the comb sharply into Snow White's head so that the poison went into her blood. Immediately she fell to the floor as if dead. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and soon afterwards the 7 dwarfs came home. When they found Snow White once more lying on the floor, they suspected that her stepmother had been again. They soon found the poison comb and pulled it out. Snow White quickly recovered and told them what had happened. Once more the dwarfs talked seriously to her. They warned her of the wickedness of her stepmother and begged her never to let anyone enter the house while they were out. Meanwhile, the Queen was hurrying through the forest, muttering to herself, "I've killed her this time! I've killed her this time!" On reaching home, she removed her disguise and stood before the mirror, asking, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, amongst the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" Just as before, the mirror replied, "Thou, O Queen, art exceedingly fair. But the truth I must speak, and this I do swear. Snow White is not dead, but living still, in a little house far over the hill. And certainly thou, O Queen, art certainly fair. This child's great beauty doth make her more fair." At these words, the Queen stamped her feet and beat on the looking-glass in her rage. "Snow White must die," she vowed, "even if it cost me my life." The Queen knew that it might prove impossible to persuade Snow White to let her into the cottage a 3rd time, so she plotted cunningly. She took a lovely apple which had 1 green cheek and 1 rosy cheek. It looked so tempting that anyone who saw it must long to eat it. Then she put poison into the red cheek of the apple, while leaving the green side free of poison. This time the Queen filled her basket with apples and disguised herself as a farmer's wife. For the 3rd time she made her way to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. "I am forbidden to open the door to anyone," said Snow White, putting her head out of the window. "It's all the same to me," replied the farmer's wife. "I only want to get rid of these apples. Here, I'll give this one to you," she went on, holding out the poisoned apple to Snow White. "I dare not take it," replied Snow White, shaking her head. The farmer's wife laughed pleasantly. "Are you afraid it's poison?" she joked. "Look, I'll cut it in 2 and we'll eat half each." This she did, holding out the rosy half of the apple to Snow White and biting into the green half herself. Snow White longed to eat the rosy half of the apple, which looked so tempting. When she saw the woman happily eating 1 half of the apple, she thought there could be no harm in eating the other half herself. So she took the rosy half of the apple and bit into it. No sooner had she done so than she fell down dead. The Queen laughed a horrible laugh and cried, "This time the dwarfs won't waken you." Then the Queen returned to her palace and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, amongst the ladies in this land, "Who is the fairest of them all?" At long last it answered, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Thus the jealous queen was finally content. When the dwarfs returned home in the evening, there lay Snow White on the floor, no longer breathing. Yet they still hoped that they might be able to revive her. They unlaced her stays, combed her hair, and washed her face. But they could not find out how she died. The dwarfs were heartbroken. They stood round her and wept, saying, "Our beautiful Snow White is dead." For 3 days and nights they stood round her, mourning. At the end of 3 days, the dwarfs knew they must bury their beloved Snow White, yet they couldn't bear to do so, for she looked as though she was still alive. So they had a glass coffin made in order that they might still see her. They wrote on the side in letters of gold that her name was Snow White and that she was a king's daughter. The dwarfs carried the glass coffin to the top of the mountain. Then they each took it in turn to sit always by the coffin, day and night. There Snow White lay, as if still alive but sleeping, with her skin as white as snow, her cheeks as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. Even the birds came and wept to see her lying so still. Snow White lay in the glass coffin for many years, and still she looked as if she was alive and only sleeping. One day it happened that a king's son found the glass coffin on top of the mountain. He could not take his eyes from the beautiful girl within it. He gazed at her and fell in love with her. "Let me have the coffin," he begged the dwarfs, "and I will give you whatever you asked." But they only answered, "We would not part with Snow White for all the gold in the world." The prince continued to plead with them. "I cannot live without her," he said. "If you will give her to me, I shall cherish her all my life." At length the dwarfs took pity on the prince and agreed to give him the coffin. As the prince's servants were carrying the coffin down the mountainside, they stumbled on the roots of a tree. The coffin was so badly jolted that the piece of apple which had stuck in Snow White's throat was flung out. She opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin and sat up. "Where am I?" she cried in surprise. The prince was overjoyed to see her alive. He told her all that had happened and how he had fallen in love with her. "Come with me to my father's palace and we shall be married," he begged. And Snow White agreed. She said goodbye to the dwarfs who had been so kind to her and had loved her so dearly. Although they were sad to lose her, they were content to know that she was alive and that she would be happy with the prince. A magnificent wedding feast was arranged for Snow White and the prince. And it happened that Snow White's stepmother was among those invited to the feast. When the queen, dressed in her finest clothes, was ready for the wedding, she stood before the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, amongst the ladies in this land, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "Thou, O queen, art exceedingly fair. But the truth I must speak, and so I do vow, that the young bride-to-be is more lovely than thou." These words so angered the queen that at first she felt she couldn't bear to go to the wedding. Later she felt she must see this new young queen. Of course, when she arrived at the feast, she recognised Snow White. Her rage was so great that she fell down in a fit and had to be taken home, where afterwards she died.